The night was thick with silence, but not the kind that comforts. It was the oppressive stillness of a battlefield holding its breath before it explodes. The Ukrainian soldier crouched in a waterlogged trench, gripping his rifle so tightly that his knuckles burned white beneath the grime. Somewhere in the black distance, Russian artillery rumbled like an approaching storm. The counteroffensive was supposed to be the turning point of the war, swift, decisive, and brutal. Instead, it was bleeding out before it had even begun. It was early June, the start of Ukraine's long-awaited push to reclaim its occupied territories. Months of planning, weeks of stockpiling ammunition, and endless hours of coordination with NATO advisors had led to this moment. The world was watching. Every headline carried the same question. Could Ukraine break through Russia's fortified lines? Yet within days, the optimism began to crack. What had been billed as a blitzkrieg-style advance had slowed to a crawl, grinding against an enemy that was entrenched, prepared, and merciless. The first sign that things were going wrong came in the form of an explosion. It wasn't the thunder of an incoming shell, but the sudden, blinding devastation of a Ukrainian armored vehicle torn apart by a mine. The Russians had turned the land into a killing field. Miles of anti-tank mines buried under soil, concrete dragon's teeth lining the approaches, and overlapping artillery zones ready to rain death on any advancing troops. Every meter forward, one Ukrainian officer would later say, was bought with blood. In Kiev, military analysts tried to keep the tone measured when speaking to foreign press. But behind closed doors, the mood was grim. Ukraine's Western allies had supplied modern tanks, precision artillery, and advanced drones, but equipment alone could not erase the brutal realities of war. The Russians had spent months reinforcing their positions, building layered defenses so deep that even the most optimistic war planners knew this would be no quick breakthrough. The soldiers at the front began to feel the strain immediately. The counteroffensive demanded constant forward momentum, but every advance brought heavier casualties. Armored columns that were supposed to punch through enemy lines were instead being picked apart by drone-guided artillery and anti-tank missiles. Infantry assaults often ended with squads pinned down, unable to move without drawing deadly fire. In one of the southern sectors, near the Zaporizhzhia region, the heat of the summer bore down like a curse. Dust clung to sweat-soaked uniforms, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burned metal. Ukrainian troops tried to maneuver through open fields but were met with withering barrages. Russian Lancet drones hunted them from above, loitering silently until they plunged down with pinpoint accuracy. The promise of rapid liberation had given way to something far darker, the grim realization that the counteroffensive might stall completely. And if it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for Ukraine's military strategy, but for the morale of the entire nation. The people of Ukraine had endured over a year of war. They had buried their dead, rebuilt bombed-out homes, and endured blackouts in the bitter winter cold. The counteroffensive was supposed to be their beacon of hope, the proof that sacrifice could lead to victory. If that hope died, so too might the will to keep fighting. President Volodymyr Zelensky, aware of how fragile public morale could be, walked a delicate line. In his nightly addresses, he spoke of progress and determination. But in private meetings with his generals, he pressed them for answers. Why wasn't the advance working? Was the intelligence wrong? Were the Western tanks underperforming? Or was Russia simply stronger and more prepared than anyone had dared admit? There were whispers in NATO circles that the Ukrainian strategy was flawed. Some believed Kiev had spread its forces too thin across multiple fronts instead of focusing on one decisive breakthrough. Others argued that the sheer density of Russian defenses meant that even the most focused attack would bleed out. But in the mud and fire of the battlefield, such debates didn't matter. For the men on the ground, survival was the only goal. Each day was a battle to live until the next sunrise. In one trench near Orikhiv, a young Ukrainian soldier named Dmytro wrote a letter to his sister. He didn't know if it would ever reach her. The artillery shells had been falling closer every day, and his unit had lost half its strength in just 2 weeks. Still, he scrawled the words as if they were a lifeline. Don't believe everything you see on TV. We are fighting, but it is hell here. Tell Mama I'm still alive. The Russian defenses were not just physical. They were psychological. Every failed assault, every destroyed vehicle, Every dead comrade weighed heavier than the last. The soldiers began to wonder if they were being sent into impossible situations, if their commanders understood what was really happening at the front. By the third week of the counteroffensive, Ukrainian losses were mounting and morale was fraying. The dream of a swift, victorious push toward the Sea of Azov was fading. Russia had not broken. In fact, they were fighting harder than ever, determined to grind the offensive into the dirt. But then, in the shadows of this near collapse, something began to shift. It started small, an intercepted Russian radio transmission here, a successful drone strike there. Ukrainian special forces began probing deeper into enemy lines, looking for weak points, places where the seemingly impenetrable defense might crack. Somewhere in those tense days, a decision was made, one that would change the entire course of the counteroffensive. It was risky, dangerous, and if it failed, it could mean the loss of everything. But if it worked, it might just turn disaster into a turning point. At that moment, few outside the highest ranks knew the plan. The soldiers on the front lines kept fighting as before, unaware that far behind them, in a dimly lit operations room, a small group of Ukrainian commanders and foreign advisors were preparing an audacious move. It would be the moment that defined the counteroffensive, and it was coming faster than anyone realized. The weeks that followed were a grinding, relentless nightmare for the Ukrainian forces. Every kilometer gained came at the cost of lives, ammunition, and morale. Villages marked on maps as minor objectives turned into fortresses of steel and concrete. Russian defensive belts, trenches, anti-tank ditches, and sprawling minefields stretched for miles. The sky buzzed with the constant presence of drones, both for reconnaissance and for dropping grenades, turning every open field into a potential killing zone. The summer sun bore down on soldiers in their sweat-soaked uniforms, but the mud from intermittent rain still clung to boots and vehicles, choking movement. Every attempt to breach enemy lines seemed to dissolve under coordinated artillery barrages. Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters swooped in from beyond the reach of man-portable air defenses, unleashing missiles on armored columns before darting away into the haze. It was a war of attrition, one that heavily favored the defenders. And the clock was ticking. The longer the counteroffensive stalled, the more time Russia had to reinforce, adapt, and harden their positions. Western analysts began to murmur doubts. Headlines in foreign media carried subtle notes of pessimism. Ukraine's counteroffensive falls short of expectations. Inside Ukrainian command centers, the mood was equally tense. Briefings were long and full of maps covered in red and blue markers, yet the red seemed stubbornly immovable. Officers debated strategy, whether to keep pushing against the heavily fortified south or redirect efforts toward weaker sectors. But both options carried enormous risks. In one tense meeting in late July, General Oleksandr Syrsky, a man whose calm demeanor masked relentless determination, addressed the gathered officers. "We are not failing," he said firmly. "We are learning, and when the moment comes, we will strike where it hurts the most." But his words couldn't mask the reality that casualties were mounting. Field hospitals near the front lines were overwhelmed. Medics worked in shifts so long that they no longer measured time in hours, but in the number of patients they had treated since sunrise. Young soldiers arrived in ambulances with haunted eyes, their uniforms torn and burned, some clutching talismans from home. A photo, a cross, a letter, things they had somehow kept through the chaos. Still, the Ukrainian spirit was not broken. Units rotated in and out of the front lines, and each rotation brought fresh determination, fueled by both desperation and defiance. Commanders adapted tactics. Instead of large armored thrusts that were easy targets for Russian artillery, smaller, more mobile assault groups began probing weak points in the lines, advancing under cover of darkness or during the chaos of artillery duels. The innovation wasn't just in tactics, it was in technology. Ukrainian engineers, many of them volunteers with backgrounds in IT and robotics, were working feverishly in workshops far from the front, building new drone prototypes, modifying commercial models to carry heavier payloads or operate with improved range and stealth. Some of these creations would soon prove pivotal, but in late summer, the counteroffensive still hung in a precarious balance. The Russians had committed elite airborne units to hold the most critical sectors, These were seasoned fighters, veterans of earlier battles in Donbass and Kherson, and they were determined to hold every inch of ground. The fighting for the small settlement of Robotyne became a microcosm of the entire campaign. Ukrainian troops pushed into the outskirts multiple times, only to be driven back by counterattacks. Buildings were reduced to rubble, tree lines, once cover for movement, were shredded by artillery fire. By the end of August, the village was little more than a name on the map, yet it became a symbol of resilience. That resilience was being noticed in Western capitals. While some commentators doubted Ukraine's progress, military planners understood the difficulty of breaking through layered defenses. NATO advisors quietly encouraged Kyiv to continue adapting, to keep probing, to force the Russians to spread themselves thin. And then came a piece of intelligence that shifted the entire calculus. A Ukrainian reconnaissance unit, operating deep behind enemy lines, reported something unusual. A section of the Russian defensive belt in the south appeared less heavily mined than the rest. Drone footage confirmed that this corridor, though still dangerous, was not as fortified as the surrounding areas. There were signs that the Russians had redeployed some of their reserves elsewhere, possibly in response to Ukrainian feints. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of opportunity. But it came with a catch. The window might be short. If Russian intelligence detected Ukrainian interest in that sector, they would reinforce it immediately. The decision weighed heavily on the Ukrainian high command. Committing to a breakthrough attempt there would mean concentrating forces and risking a devastating counterattack. But the alternative was to keep grinding forward at the same slow pace, losing men and momentum. On a humid night in early September, the decision was made. Ukrainian assault units were to prepare for a concentrated push, supported by precision artillery, long-range missile strikes, and, most crucially, coordinated drone operations on a scale not yet seen in the war. This was where the months of adaptation would pay off. Special drone teams had been trained to operate in swarms, overwhelming Russian electronic warfare systems. Engineers had developed drones with hardened GPS systems and pre-programmed flight paths, making them less vulnerable to jamming. And for the first time, these drones would be used not just for reconnaissance or harassing enemy positions, but to actively clear paths through minefields for advancing troops. The soldiers knew what was at stake. In makeshift assembly areas near the front, commanders gathered their men and women for final briefings. Maps were unrolled on crates. The air smelled of diesel and gun oil. Some troops smoked in silence. Others shared quiet jokes to break the tension. Many called or texted family members, knowing communication might be impossible once the operation began. As dawn approached, artillery units began their opening barrage. The thunder of shells echoed across the fields, and the horizon lit up with flashes. Drones launched from hidden positions, their small engines buzzing like angry wasps. They skimmed low over the fields, then climbed to altitude to begin their missions, some to spot targets, others to drop explosives directly onto enemy trenches and gun emplacements. Ukrainian infantry began moving forward, their silhouettes barely visible in the early morning mist. Behind them, armored vehicles rolled in staggered formations, each one a precious asset to be protected at all costs. The Russians responded swiftly, unleashing counter-barrages and scrambling drones of their own. The air became a chaotic dance of metal and fire, explosions sending plumes of dirt skyward, tracer rounds streaking in arcs, drones weaving through smoke. And then, for a moment, it seemed like the breakthrough might actually happen. Ukrainian units reached the first trench line faster than anticipated, catching the defenders off guard. Grenades were tossed into dugouts, and close-quarters fighting erupted in the narrow passages. The smell of cordite mixed with the acrid stench of burning earth. But as with every moment of hope in this war, danger lurked just ahead. Russian reserves, alerted by the intensity of the attack, began moving toward the breach. Ukrainian commanders faced a critical decision: commit more forces now to exploit the gap, or pull back to avoid overextension. The choice would determine whether the counteroffensive would turn a corner or collapse under its own ambition. The fields of southern Ukraine had turned into a graveyard for machines. Burned-out Russian armored vehicles sat like blackened skeletons across the landscape, their metal carcasses twisted and still steaming in the summer heat. But nearby, The wrecks of Ukrainian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles told the same grim story. Both sides had bled heavily for every inch of contested ground. By late July, Kiev's counteroffensive was dangerously close to stalling. Casualties were mounting, morale was fraying, and the dream of a decisive breakthrough seemed to be fading into the dust. The Russians had anticipated every move. Miles of trenches, concrete bunkers, and fortified machine gun nests formed an unbroken defensive belt. Anti-tank ditches zigzagged across the countryside like deep scars, designed to funnel Ukrainian armor into kill zones where pre-sighted artillery would rain death from above. Mines, hundreds of thousands of them, lay hidden under soil and grass, some freshly laid by remote-controlled vehicles in the dead of night. Ukrainian engineers would clear one field, only to find it mined again the next day. Commanders in Kiev were now faced with a nightmare scenario. The offensive was eating up men, machines, and ammunition at a rate that even Western supplies could barely sustain. The much-heralded counteroffensive risked becoming just another grinding war of attrition, exactly the kind of fight Moscow wanted. And then, just when the situation seemed to be collapsing into stalemate, a shift began. One that no one saw coming in its full scope. It started with intelligence. Weeks earlier, deep inside Russian-controlled territory, Ukrainian partisans had been feeding information to Kiev's military intelligence agency, the GUR. These weren't soldiers, they were school teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, people who had seen their towns occupied and refused to bow. Using encrypted messaging apps and disguised satellite uplinks, they transmitted details of Russian troop movements, fuel convoys, and, most critically, weaknesses in the layered defensive lines. One such message arrived in the hands of Colonel Oleksandr Kovalchuk, a wiry officer with decades of service and a reputation for calm under fire. The report claimed that in the sector near Robotyne, one of the Russian minefields had been only partially replenished after a Ukrainian artillery strike. In theory, this could create a narrow corridor, no more than 15 meters wide, through which armored vehicles might pass if they moved fast and in tight coordination. But it would require a daring daylight assault under the eyes of Russian drones and within range of their heaviest guns. The idea seemed almost suicidal. Yet, the alternative was slow destruction. Kovalchuk decided to present it to the general staff. At the same time, in a dimly lit operations center miles away, Ukrainian drone operators were noticing something unusual. Russian electronic warfare jamming, normally fierce and constant, had dropped in intensity in certain areas. For reasons not immediately clear, the Russians had shifted some of their EW units northward, leaving gaps in their coverage. Those gaps meant Ukrainian reconnaissance drones could fly deeper, linger longer, and stream back real-time imagery without being blinded or forced down. For the first time in weeks, commanders could see the enemy's defensive lines in crisp detail: the zigzag trenches, the ammo dumps camouflaged under netting, the telltale heat signatures of generators powering radar and communications arrays. And they could see something else: movement. Russian units were rotating out of certain positions, perhaps believing that Ukraine's attacks there had already been exhausted. It was a rare moment of opportunity. The question was, could Kiev act fast enough to exploit it before the Russians noticed their mistake? The decision came on a hot, cloudless morning. Orders were transmitted to a select group of units. Prepare for a rapid, concentrated push toward the Robotyne sector. The assault would involve infantry, armored spearheads, combat engineers, and, crucially, swarms of drones to blind and harass the Russian defenses. Western-supplied precision artillery would pound enemy positions in the hours before the attack, aiming to disrupt communications and keep the defenders pinned down. Among the troops selected for the mission was Sergeant Mykola Hertsenko, a veteran of the early 2022 battles who had seen more than his share of loss. His platoon was tasked with leading the infantry element, clearing out trench networks once the armor broke through. In a whispered conversation with a comrade the night before, Mykola admitted he didn't expect to come back. "If we stop here," he said, "everything we've lost will have been for nothing. Better to push and die than sit and rot." As dawn broke, the sky shimmered with the heat of another brutal summer day. The first artillery barges roared out, sending shells screaming into Russian positions. Columns of black smoke curled upward from distant tree lines, marking the destruction of ammunition depots and command posts. Overhead, the distinctive buzz of Ukrainian drones filled the air as they hunted for hidden targets, dropping small explosives directly into trench-firing slits and onto parked vehicles. Then the tanks moved. Leopard 2s and older T-64s rolled forward in tight formation, their engines growling and treads grinding over the dry soil. Behind them came the mine-clearing vehicles, armored behemoths fitted with heavy rollers and plows, designed to trigger or unearth explosives before the main force passed through. The moment they hit the suspected corridor in the minefield, Russian artillery opened up. Shells exploded around the advancing line, kicking up fountains of dirt and shrapnel. 2 vehicles were hit within minutes, their crews scrambling out and running for cover. But the column kept moving. By midday, they had breached the outer defenses and were pouring into the gap. Mikola's infantry surged forward, rifles and grenade launchers at the ready, sprinting from crater to crater as they closed on the Russian trenches. The fighting was vicious and close quarters. Grenades were tossed into bunkers, flamethrowers roared in confined spaces, and the deafening rattle of machine guns echoed across the fields. The smell of burning fuel and cordite clung to everything. The Russians fought hard but were clearly rattled. Some surrendered, hands raised, faces pale with shock. Others fought to the last, forcing Ukrainian troops to clear them room by room, trench by trench. By late afternoon, the first reports reached Kiev. The Robotyne Gap was real, and Ukrainian forces had not only penetrated it, they had expanded it. For the first time in weeks, the word momentum returned to the conversations of Ukrainian commanders. Still, it was far from over. The Russians, stung by the breach, began to pour reinforcements into the area. Fresh units moved up under cover of night, and artillery fire intensified once again. The Ukrainians now had to hold their fragile corridor while expanding it, a dangerous balancing act that would test every ounce of their skill and endurance. In those tense hours, Kiev's leadership realized something crucial. The counteroffensive survival would depend not on a single dramatic breakthrough, but on the ability to adapt quickly, exploit fleeting opportunities, and coordinate across every level, from the drone operators watching screens in darkened rooms to the infantry crawling through the dust under enemy fire. This was the turning point, not the end of the struggle, but the moment when the tide began, however slowly, to shift. 72 hours earlier, many had believed the counteroffensive was on the brink of failure. Now, a narrow, smoking corridor carved through Robotyne stood as proof that even in the face of overwhelming defenses, there was still a way forward. It had cost blood and steel to find it, and it would cost more to keep it, but the alternative had been defeat. And in war, sometimes that is enough. The morning after the breakthrough, the fields around Robotyne were eerily quiet. Smoke still rose from the tree lines where Russian positions had been obliterated hours earlier, and the distant thud of artillery echoed like a fading drumbeat. Ukrainian soldiers, exhausted but exhilarated, advanced cautiously. The smell of burnt earth, diesel, and cordite hung heavy in the air. What had been a static, bloody grind for months now felt like the first breath after surfacing from deep underwater. But war has a way of punishing optimism. As soon as Ukrainian commanders realized they had punched through one of the strongest defensive lines in the sector, they knew the Russians would not let it stand unchallenged. The breakthrough was not an end. It was an opening act for what could become an even bloodier confrontation. The first consequence was immediate and tangible: territory. The capture of key positions in the southern Zaporizhia region meant Ukrainian forces now had a wedge pointing directly toward Tokmak, a vital logistics hub for the Russian army. Cutting off Tokmak could unravel the entire southern front for Moscow. But to get there, the Ukrainians needed to hold what they had taken, and that, they knew, was about to be tested. Within 48 hours, Russian forces began a furious counterattack. Armored columns emerged from concealed positions further east, moving under the cover of pre-registered artillery fire. Reconnaissance drones spotted the formations early, giving Ukrainian gunners precious minutes to prepare. When the Russian tanks crossed into open ground, the fields lit up with explosions. Anti-tank guided missiles streaked from hidden positions, and artillery batteries unleashed devastating barrages. Still, the Russians pushed hard. Their tactics were brutally simple. Overwhelm the new Ukrainian positions with constant pressure, force the defenders to expend ammunition, and exploit any gap in the line. Wave after wave crashed against the Ukrainian defenses. The fields that had been quiet at dawn were, by noon, churned into a landscape of smoke, fire, and screams. In those first days after the breakthrough, the Ukrainians suffered heavy casualties. Medics worked around the clock, evacuating the wounded under relentless shelling. Supply trucks were targeted by Russian drones, forcing resupply missions to be conducted at night, headlights off, guided only by moonlight and GPS. Every kilometer gained was now a liability, an exposed wedge the Russians were determined to break. It was during these harrowing hours that Ukrainian strategy began to evolve. Before the breakthrough, the offensive had been defined by slow, grinding assaults aimed at wearing down the Russian defenses. Now, it became a battle of flexibility and deception. Commanders realized they could not simply dig in and wait for the Russians to exhaust themselves. They needed to disrupt the counterattack before it gained momentum. The shift began with mobility. Small, fast-moving assault groups replaced large, vulnerable formations. Infantry units moved under the cover of drones that scouted every ridge and treeline ahead of them. Artillery fire was coordinated in near real time, with forward observers calling in strikes on target seconds after spotting them. Instead of holding rigid defensive lines, the Ukrainians began to trade ground selectively, pulling back from untenable positions only to counterattack hours later when Russian units overextended themselves. One of the most decisive adaptations came from the integration of newly supplied Western artillery systems with Ukraine's drone reconnaissance network. Every Russian vehicle movement was tracked, mapped, and prioritized for destruction. Precision strikes began to bleed the Russian counteroffensive dry, knocking out supply trucks, command posts, and artillery batteries deep behind the front. In the village of Verbov, a key point along the axis toward Tokmak, Ukrainian troops staged a daring maneuver. Feigning retreat, they allowed Russian units to advance into the outskirts. As the Russians began to consolidate, Ukrainian artillery unleashed a devastating storm of shells, while infantry units flanked from both sides. The ambush not only destroyed a significant portion of the Russian spearhead, but also sent a psychological shockwave through enemy ranks. Still, the cost was immense. Ukrainian soldiers often fought without sleep for 48 hours, cycling between frontline combat and urgent fortification work. Food rations ran low, and ammunition stocks were stretched thin. But morale surprisingly held. The knowledge that they had not only broken through but also repelled the first waves of the counterattack became a source of grim pride. Russian commanders, frustrated by the inability to collapse the Ukrainian wedge, shifted tactics again. They began targeting civilian infrastructure in nearby towns, hoping to force Ukrainian units to divert resources toward humanitarian relief. Power stations were struck, water supplies sabotaged, and refugee columns targeted with artillery. The psychological toll was severe. Soldiers on the front knew their families were being terrorized behind the lines. But if the Russians hoped to fracture Ukraine's will, the effect was the opposite. Civilian volunteers poured into the war effort, delivering supplies, reinforcing fortifications, and even helping to camouflage vehicles against drone surveillance. The front lines became a shared cause, not just for soldiers but for the communities that sustained them. By the third week after the breakthrough, Ukrainian strategy had shifted into what military analysts would later call elastic offense. It was a blend of holding key terrain, raiding enemy positions, and disrupting Russian logistics, always probing, never static. The initiative, once firmly in Russian hands during the early summer, now belonged to Ukraine. And yet, the risk was ever present. One successful Russian push could undo weeks of hard-won gains. Commanders walked a razor's edge between consolidating their positions and overextending into dangerous territory. Every decision was a gamble, with lives and momentum in the balance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the shattered horizon, a Ukrainian officer stood on a ridge overlooking the newly captured ground. He had been there when the offensive began, had watched friends fall in the mud, and had seen the line shift inch by bloody inch. Now, with Russian artillery thudding in the distance, he knew the battle was far from over. But he also knew something had changed. The wedge they had driven into the Russian lines was no longer just a tactical gain, it was a symbol, a sign that the stalemate could be broken, that the tide could shift. In Kiev, military planners studied satellite imagery, drone footage, and intercepted communications. They could see the strain on the Russian side, logistical bottlenecks, faltering morale, and command disputes. The challenge now was to exploit these weaknesses without overcommitting. The plan they began to shape would take the war into a new phase, one that could push deeper into occupied territory. For the soldiers on the ground, that meant one thing: more fighting, more danger, and more sacrifice. But as night fell and the front lines settled into an uneasy lull, there was also a flicker of hope. For the first time in months, they were not merely surviving, they were advancing. The dawn over southern Ukraine was unlike any the soldiers had seen in months. Mist rose from the fields, curling around the shattered remains of vehicles and bunkers, as if the land itself was exhaling after weeks of unrelenting violence. The counteroffensive, once teetering on the edge of collapse, had begun to consolidate gains. Ukrainian forces now held a wedge of territory that penetrated deep into Russian lines, threatening supply routes and key command posts. But with progress came peril. Russian forces, though weakened, were not defeated. They launched repeated counterattacks, probing the Ukrainian positions with artillery, drones, and infantry assaults designed to test the resolve and adaptability of the defenders. Each attack was a high-stakes gamble, and each response demanded split-second decisions. Ukrainian commanders, weary but resolute, coordinated every movement with precision born from months of combat, experience, and sheer desperation. The soldiers at the front had changed. Fatigue and fear remained, but they were now tempered by a fierce sense of purpose. Every destroyed Russian vehicle, every captured trench, every successful ambush reinforced the reality that they could win. Not merely survive, but reshape the battlefield. Young soldiers who had arrived at the front skeptical, nervous, or resigned, now moved with calculated confidence, relying on each other and on the innovations that had turned the tide. Amid the chaos, technology played a decisive role. Swarms of Ukrainian drones, some armed, some dedicated to reconnaissance, patrolled the skies, feeding constant intelligence to artillery units and command centers. Precision strikes disrupted Russian reinforcements before they could arrive in full force. Newly adapted mobile artillery platforms shifted positions quickly, avoiding counter-battery fire while delivering punishing barrages. Every element of the Ukrainian military machine was synchronized, creating a rhythm that the Russians struggled to match. Yet the human cost remained staggering. Field hospitals overflowed with the wounded, and the constant strain wore on everyone from frontline soldiers to logistical crews supplying ammunition, food, and medical care. For many, the psychological toll was as acute as the physical. They had stared death in the face repeatedly, and each narrow escape was a reminder of the fragility of life in war. Letters from home, phone calls and stolen moments of silence, and brief flashes of camaraderie were all that kept them grounded amidst the unrelenting roar of battle. Despite these challenges, the Ukrainian command pressed on. The objective was clear: expand the wedge, secure key logistical hubs, and push the Russian forces into a reactive posture. This meant carefully coordinated attacks, feints to draw enemy units into kill zones, and relentless pressure on vulnerable positions. The Russians, frustrated and stretched thin, began to make mistakes. Supply lines became overextended, communication faltered under constant electronic interference, and morale cracked under the weight of sustained losses. In one decisive operation near Tokmak, Ukrainian forces executed a masterful combination of deception and force. Infantry units feigned an advance on the southern outskirts, drawing Russian troops into prepared zones. Meanwhile, armored units, guided by drones and forward observers, struck from unexpected directions, cutting off retreat routes and isolating pockets of defenders. Artillery units rained destruction from a distance, obliterating supply trucks and communication hubs. Within hours, a crucial sector had been secured, and Ukrainian forces had seized the initiative fully. The breakthrough was not only tactical but symbolic. For the first time in the counteroffensive, Ukraine had demonstrated that coordinated strategy, technological adaptation, and sheer determination could overcome entrenched Russian defenses. News of the success spread quickly, boosting morale not only among soldiers but across the nation. For the citizens of Kiev, Kharkiv, and beyond, the counteroffensive was no longer a desperate gamble. It was proof that victory, while costly, was attainable. Yet the battle was far from over. Russian forces still controlled key areas, and the front lines remained volatile. Each day required vigilance, quick adaptation, and unwavering resolve. Ukrainian commanders knew that consolidation was critical. Every newly captured position had to be fortified, supply lines secured, and troops rotated to prevent exhaustion. The difference between holding territory and losing it was measured in hours, sometimes minutes. Amid the strategy and combat, stories of individual heroism emerged. Soldiers who had crawled through minefields to relay vital information, medics who risked everything to save the wounded, and engineers who cleared paths for armored advances. All became part of the living legend of the counteroffensive. Their courage underscored a fundamental truth. Technology and tactics mattered, but the human spirit was decisive. The psychological dimension of the conflict also played a crucial role. Ukrainian troops had faced months of near-impossible odds, and every successful operation now reinforced their confidence. Conversely, Russian units, accustomed to holding static positions and reacting to offensives, faced constant unpredictability. The elasticity and unpredictability of Ukrainian strategy undermined the morale of even the most disciplined Russian formations, leading to surrenders, desertions, and hesitations that further amplified the Ukrainian advantage. By the fourth week of the consolidated advance, the front lines had shifted significantly. Areas once heavily defended by Russian forces were now under Ukrainian control, and the wedge carved through their lines threatened to split southern forces in two. Supply and reinforcement routes that had seemed secure for months were now vulnerable. The dynamic of the battlefield had fundamentally changed, and the counteroffensive, once on the brink of failure, had become a model of adaptive warfare. As evening fell, the soldiers took stock of their surroundings. Burned-out vehicles, shattered buildings, and craters punctuated the landscape, a harsh reminder of the cost. Yet amid the devastation, there was also evidence of progress. Ukrainian flags waved over key positions, communication lines hummed with coordinated activity, and units prepared for the next push with renewed determination. The momentum was theirs, but it had been won at great expense. Back in Kiev, President Zelensky addressed the nation. His speech balanced caution with hope. He acknowledged the sacrifices, honored the fallen, and emphasized that while the offensive had achieved critical successes, the war was far from over. He spoke of resilience, unity, and the enduring will of the Ukrainian people to defend their homeland. Across living rooms and crowded streets, citizens responded with pride, resolve, and renewed support for those on the front lines. In reflecting on the counteroffensive, military analysts would later identify several key lessons. The ability to adapt strategy in real time, integrate new technology effectively, and maintain morale under extreme conditions proved decisive. The breakthrough demonstrated that even against well-fortified defenses, opportunity could be exploited with courage, planning, and coordination. The human element, soldiers' determination, ingenuity, and resilience, remained central to success. As the sun set on the newly won territory, Ukrainian troops prepared for the next phase. They fortified positions, rotated fatigued units, and planned follow-up operations to exploit weaknesses further. The breakthrough at Robotyne and Novodorivka was not an end but a foundation upon which future successes could be built. Every meter gained was a testament to sacrifice, planning, and unyielding will. The counteroffensive, which had once seemed destined to fail, had transformed into a story of resilience and adaptation. From the brink of collapse, Ukrainian forces had leveraged intelligence, technology, and strategy to regain the initiative. The lessons were clear. In modern warfare, flexibility, innovation, and morale are as critical as numbers and firepower. Those who could adapt rapidly, maintain cohesion, and exploit fleeting opportunities would seize the advantage. And as night fell over the southern fields, a quiet reflection spread among the soldiers. They had endured months of hell, faced near impossible odds, and emerged with momentum. The cost had been high, but so had the reward. Victory was not guaranteed, but hope was alive once more. In the end, the counteroffensive taught a lesson far beyond the battlefield. That determination, ingenuity, and unity can turn the tide even in the darkest hours. For Ukraine, it was proof that perseverance, courage, and the willingness to seize opportunity could redefine the course of a conflict that many believed was unwinnable. As the camera of history focuses on these events, one truth emerges above all. Wars are not won by machines alone, nor by strategy alone. They are won by the human spirit, its capacity to endure, adapt, and fight relentlessly against overwhelming odds. The story of the Ukrainian counteroffensive is, therefore, not just a military tale. It is a testament to resilience, to the will to survive and to prevail, and to the enduring belief that even when the odds are stacked impossibly high, the brave can carve a path to victory. And so, as the soldiers rested under the stars, the nation reflected. Even in the darkest moments, courage and ingenuity can change history. The battlefield had been harsh, the losses severe, but the lesson was clear. When determination meets opportunity, even the nearly impossible can be achieved. If you want to see more stories of courage, strategy, and the hidden details of conflicts shaping our world, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the truth behind the battles is often more astonishing than you can imagine.